Well, welcome everyone. I am Adrián Pérez Melgoza, the director of the Humanities Institute at Stony Brook, and we are delighted to have this opportunity to listen and converse with Solana Chehtman, who's the director of civic programs at The Shed in New York City. We'll know more about her after Professor Sol Lee presents her, but we want to welcome Solana to our institute, even if it's in its virtual form today. For now, to introduce today's guest, Professor Sol Lee from the Department of Art, who has been instrumental in organizing today's talk as part of a cycle of lectures exploring the social impact of the arts and the importance of cultural democracy. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sol Lee, who will introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrián. Thanks for the introduction. And I also wanted to thank Adrian and also Andrew for organizing this talk. Solana is a great friend, and I've been dying to learn more about her work. And this talk launches the public programming for Printing Solidarity, Continental Graphics from Cuba, which is an exhibition that will be up on the screen. Are you seeing the screen of the Zucchier Gallery? Yes. So this is the website for the Zucchier Gallery with upcoming exhibitions, including Printing Solidarity. So this exhibition is co-curated by 4 art history graduate students, Sarah Myers, Daniel Menzo, Elise Armani, and Amy Kang, in collaboration with the Zucchier Gallery, Karen Levitov, and Georgia Lamar, sorry. And is produced by myself. Collaboration has been invaluable, and also this experience of collaborating with individuals and organizations has been very rewarding. So I wanted to thank the Zucchier Gallery Art Department, as well as Humanities Institute once again. Solana Chehtman, as Adrián said, it currently serves as a director of civic programs at The Shed. Most recently, she organized a 3-part public programs, Culture Policy, Pindell's Legacy, and Fighting Dark, in conjunction with Howardena Pindell, Robe, Fire, Water at The Shed. Howardena herself is a legend on campus, so I'm sure many of you know about her work, consider her as a mentor and teacher. With over 15 years as a cultural producer and arts administrator, Solana has collaborated with a range of cultural organizations in New York, including Creative Time, the New Museum, the Queens Museum of Art, and the Tribeca Film Institute. Prior to joining The Shed, most recently, Solana was Vice President of Public Engagement at Friends of the High Line, where for 5 years and throughout different roles, she devised and implemented authentic strategies to creatively engage with neighbors and New Yorkers through experimental and participatory artist-led experiences. As an art historian myself, researching and writing about artists involved in social movements, I am thrilled to hear about how arts organizations envision and execute public engagement or civic engagement, especially with the new as well as old challenges in the arts that we face today during the pandemic. So I would like to welcome Solana.
Thank you so much, Sol, for the invitation, and thank you, Adrian, Adrián, Andrew, for having me here, and thank you all of you for being here. I'm super excited to share a little bit about my work with you all. So I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Hi, thumbs up if you can see. And you know, today what I wanted to do is I changed the title slightly because as I was thinking about how to share this work, I wanted to concentrate in certain concepts that I think for me are really instrumental in thinking about my work and thinking about my work strategically. So I'm going to start very briefly by introducing myself and just following what Sol said. I teach also at CUNY, and so I always like on my first class to introduce myself through art, and I ask my students to do the same, to bring one piece that is really important to them, I think, because that's our shared language. This is a piece from an artist called Marcelo Brodsky. I'm from Argentina, he's from Argentina. He actually went to my high school. And this piece is a part of the Metropolitan Museum collection. So it's an amazing piece. It's very important. I saw it for the first time on my last year of high school. And it was the time when he did it and when he presented it for the first time in my high school. So in our hall. And it's a piece, it's literally a photo of his class that was taken in the 70s. And this was 1996. So you can see my gray hair is for something. And he had come back to our country after being exiled for many, many years and started finding out what had happened to all his classmates. What had happened in between the 70s and 1996 had been a dictatorship that had disappeared, as we say, many young people and many of his classmates. And so it's basically a photograph that he intervened with colored pencils, basically saying, you know, like some of them have lives in their chest and some of them say what happened to them. And it was the first time that I saw art. You know, I loved going to museums and I loved going to performances and films. But it was the first time that art spoke to me in a very personal way. And to me, you know, this is why I do the work that I do. When I, at 18, told my parents I wanted to study art history, they were like, no, that's not a career. That can be a hobby, as many people did and do still, especially in developing countries like mine, where, you know, economic stability was really important. So I studied international studies. I then did a master in public policy and development management. I worked in social corporate responsibility. I worked with the UN in Haiti in the previous, earthquake or after the previous earthquake. So I had more of a social policy life while I did arts and arts engagement on the side with friends very independently. And then I had the chance of coming to New York and to the US 9 years ago to study education policy at Teachers College, and discovered arts administration and discovered a world in the arts, a career in the arts that I didn't know existed in a way, basically combining those two passions of mine. So I wanted to share that a little bit because also I feel it's really important for us all to know, that careers are not always linear and that we can, discover things as we go and make changes as we go. I don't know. To me, it's very important to say. So, this idea of cultural democracy versus democratization of culture. The idea of democratization of culture spans from the 1950s, and I'm not going to do a history lesson here at all, but I do want to introduce these concepts because I think they're really important to how we think about this work. And it was born in the 1950s more based on the idea of like barriers to access, right? Like that people had most of all an economic barrier to accessing the arts. And so how could we democratize the access to this, very highbrow art that was the right art, and give access to people? But it was an access that it was only like an access to, as I say, peek in, like check it out. Versus that, there's the idea of cultural democracy, which is completely different. And it comprises a set of related commitments, as I call them. Protecting and promoting cultural diversity, and the right to culture, and the right to culture not only as a consumer, but also as a producer. Encouraging active participation in community cultural life. enabling people to participate in policy decisions that have to do and affect their quality of their cultural lives. And finally, ensuring fair and equitable access, entirely understood, to the arts. So when I think about this is what drives my work. And I think cultural organizations, particularly mainstream, predominantly white cultural organizations as the ones that I worked in, have amazing opportunities and also have important limitations. And we need to acknowledge those and work within those frameworks. So I'm going to start with the idea of cultural empowerment. And cultural empowerment, I think, and I'm going to go through 5 concepts. I'm going to introduce those actually now, so you know what's coming. Cultural empowerment, empathy, social capital, belonging, and civic participation. And I go with on those like in order, not because I think there's necessarily like an evolution or a linear progression, but there is some sort of relationship, although they're iterative and cyclical, and all of them have a place in this work. So for cultural empowerment, in its most basic definition, is linked to empowering people to be proud of their cultural identity, many times cultural heritage as well. And the way that I see this from cultural organizations is the idea of how can we as cultural organizations ensure representation and visibility. So I'm going to go through independent projects to show how I did this in the past. In this case, for example, I was at the Highline and we wanted to do poetry work. It was April, Poetry Month, and we thought, let's bring poetry to the Highline. And we partnered with the American Academy of Poetry. And we wanted to think of poetry, as a whole. And so this, for example, is a performance put together with Other Voices, a collective that works with American Sign Language. These were American Sign Language, or actually deaf poets who wrote poetry in American Sign Language, performing it in American Sign Language for a mostly deaf audience, right? And it didn't have translation into English because we wanted to, center the deaf community, American Sign Language as a language, see the beauty of it as well. We had young poets who were, writing live and having their poetry projected in nearby walls. We had New Yorican poets, right? New Yorican are usually Puerto Rican community in New York, many of them already like second generation. And this is spoken word actually, and it was so amazing to see and to get to people to access this. The idea in this case of representation and visibility has to do with this concept of being a mirror and being a window, right? And we always say, for people seeing themselves represented is so important. To seeing themselves valued and on the stage in a way is really, really important. I always go back to, I'm sure you all know, Fred Wilson's Guarded View from 1991, which basically is a piece that he did because he didn't see himself represented in the museum. He only saw himself represented in room guards, right? And so how do we center this as art, as quality art, as the center of what we want to provide, The second piece to this cultural empowerment chapter is the idea of being a platform. And again, it's very, linked to the idea of providing visibility. In this case, I go a little bit further and say, it's not only providing visibility, it's providing support, is commissioning. And so to share a little bit about that, this was another project that I did at the Highline very early on. One of the things that we wanted to do at the Highline when I started, the Highline, had changed or the neighborhood where the Highline is had changed so much since the Highline was built and opened. There had been so much displacement and gentrification, and we wanted to, pay tribute to the communities that had been there for so long, to the people that had made those neighborhoods. To us, it was really important. And so in this case, there had been this project, the Renegade Cabaret, that was very short-lived. It was 2 months, and then they closed it. It was a neighbor who lives on still today, Patty Heffley, on 20th and 10th. And while the first section of the Highline was being built, a light of the construction of the second section was like misdirected to her fire escape. And so she called and, complained and said, hey, like this light is bothering me. And then after a while, she was like, okay, I'll make the best of it. She was a photographer, a punk musician, and she started inviting her friends to perform on her fire escape. And so we did this series called Out of Line in homage to her, and taking advantage of that story, inviting other artists to perform. The first full year, we used this genie scissor lift as the fire escape. This is actually the friends of Patty Heffley and her doing our very first show as the Renegade Cabaret. And then we invited artists like Nar's sister, the Heartbeat Opera, who does, opera in a very accessible, very fun, very queer way. We had Sean Leonardo, who currently has an amazing piece at For Freedom's Park. I recommend you all go see, who, had done a version of this piece at Brick based on the Invisible Man. And literally together with a New Orleans Second Line, did this beautiful procession. It was that summer where we had, 5 men killed by police, and he was, invocating them. It was just so special. Yara Travieso, who did a piece looking at, the end of the American dream from a feminist perspective, a feminist Latinx perspective. Janani Balasubramanian, Kenya Robinson. All of these pieces had, not only was the Highline a platform for performance, it was a platform for diverse issues and urgent issues of our time, as we say. They were participatory in many, many ways. This literally was a karaoke where people could come up and sing. James Scruggs made a piece that was actually like a political rally happening in 2040, and people could come in and cheer, They had something about how the body moves in public space and what the role of art is in that context. The second concept that I want to go through is the idea of empathy. And this is an idea that is so, embedded in everything that we talk every day that I'm not going to go too much into describing it. But I do want to say, like, to me, the concept of empathy is key in and unlocking other concepts such as solidarity, collaboration, collectivity. And I think, it's at the base of all that. And that's why I feel that as cultural organizations, a big part of our responsibility is to work towards empathy. And in that sense, interpretation and contextualization are a big tool that we have. And going to Salt's introduction and, how amazing of a beacon Howardena is, we did indeed create 3 series for her show. The way, that cultural organizations many times think about shows is like, here's the art, come enjoy. And I believe that it's really important to provide, entry points to different people with different backgrounds. When I say, like, we don't need to think about barriers to access, it's not that we don't, it's that, like, how do we think about them? And so we always want to think of people not as in a needs-based way. It's not like, oh, they need education, we are going to educate them. It's more like they bring assets, they bring different experiences, they bring different knowledges. How can we connect with what they bring? So in this case, and knowing, the Shed is a new organization, this happened at the Shed in October last year. Actually, it was, the first program after the pandemic. The show, I don't know, I hope you all got to see it, was really beautiful, but also extremely poignant. The central piece of the exhibition is a video looking at, the history of lynchings in the South. And to me, it was really important. How are we gonna welcome people in this moment of pandemic and of pain and of, post George Floyd and post all the conversations that we're having? How are we as again, mainstream, predominantly white cultural organization gonna provide context and care for people that are coming to see this show? And so we created three public programs, 2 conversation series. One is this. It was kind of an homage to Howardena, who has been so influential in so many people's careers, and we wanted to pay tribute to that. So this is the Legacy series. We invited, curators and critics, we invited educators, and we invited artists to be in dialogue with her. And that was part of the idea, right? It wasn't to talk about her, it was to be in dialogue with her. And I have to say that the most moving portions of this program happened when the cameras were turned off, unfortunately. And all of the curators or the artists, etc., encountered Howardena, on Zoom, and were telling her stories about what she meant to them and to their career. And these were all, really important, really recognized professionals. So it was extremely moving. And I think it was extremely important for Howardena herself, I hope, and for everyone else to be in conversation with her and talk about their practice, share how practices have changed since she first started, in this case, as a curator in MoMA in the 80s, The second piece to this was a Culture Meets Policy, or Culture X Policy series. We had our amazing friend and colleague, Parana Reddy, moderate these 3. I had, as I was doing research for this, I had read a beautiful article by Michelle Alexander. I always mistake Michelle Alexander on the New York Times, saying, titled "America, This Is Our Chance." And it talked a little bit about, this is our chance to really do things differently. And it talked about the 3 keys to this, which were economic justice, kind of the prison system and the justice system, and economic justice and democratic. And so the idea of participation and representation. And so we wanted to bring all of those issues because they were so linked to what Howardena was presenting in her work. And it was kind of how, based on what Howardena is presenting, how do we think this moving forward? What are the solutions-oriented conversations that we can have in a multidisciplinary way? So we had artists, we had policymakers, we had, analysts, from all different perspectives come together to discuss, okay, what's the situation and what can we do moving forward? And the third piece, I always love artists in dialogue with other artists. And I had the chance to work with Kamau Ware from Black Gotham Experience in the past at the Highline. And I know how an amazing, educator, historian, and artist he is. So I'm an immigrant, and I always put that first because I know, or I cannot even know all that I don't know, but I know that I don't know. And so I always want to partner with others who are very knowledgeable. And I had the feeling, Howardena's video was very centered on the history of the South. And since I've come to New York, that's the only place I've lived in the US, everyone says, well, that's the South. This is different. And I have the feeling that it's yes and, or not that much. And I wanted to see, okay, what's the dialogue that we can establish between that history that Howardena is unearthing and the history of New York? And so she was mainly looking at 1963, the Children's Crusade in Birmingham. And so he took that day looked at 1863, the race riots that happened here in New York, in the context of the Civil War, and you know, people getting to go fight. And so he did and he always, his practice is basically doing walking tours, but we were in the middle of the pandemic, so we couldn't do that. We had started working together before the pandemic, and that's what we were gonna do, but then we had to adapt. So he created a audio version that is still on our website if anyone wants to do it, and then a video version of it as well, because accessibility is really, really important to us. And so he created this beautiful, moving, and again, very poignant audio tour of really important places and markers throughout the city in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Luckily enough, ending with notes of hope and ending in Woodsville, and that story, which I hope you all are familiar with, and if not, again, I invite you to go to this Flatbush or Crown Heights and visit Woodsville, which is such an amazing place of history. And this is a different project, but serves the same purpose, and I thought I would share as well, just to see, okay, interpretation and contextualization, yes, it can be, you know, conversations. When we think about public programs, many times we think about conversations, but it can also be a project like this. In this project, Ander Michelson, an artist who was resident at the Queen's Museum for many years, did this gorgeous project. I was working, you know, with, of course, Cecilia Alemani and the art team at the Highline. They had the exhibition that year, and we wanted to figure out how to contextualize the exhibition without it being necessarily like an exhibition tour. And so Ander created this piece that she had done a version of also at Storm King with New Orleans Second Line, performing pieces that were in dialogue with the art piece that they were interpreting. So music as an entryway to art, right? And so in this case, for this beautiful piece, Somos 11 Millones, were 11 million, around, you know, how many immigrants there are in this country. They played a Mercedes Sosa song, an Argentinian musician, talking about, like, you know, how we survive and how we resist, right? And then, you know, she played, there was a Sable Liz Smith piece, and she played, you know, a hip hop song that had to do with her history and the history of her father, and that was the inspiration for her piece, you know. So taking out of inspiration of different pieces, a popular song that was an entry point to what the art piece was about. The second piece to this is the idea of relevance. There we go, because otherwise we can't see all the text, sorry about that. And the idea of relevance, I hope you've heard about this concept. There's a wonderful, wonderful book by Nina Simon called The Art of the Relevance, or The Art of Relevance. And the idea of relevance has to do with this idea of kind of resonance and deep connection and meaning. And so thinking about relevance, I wanted to share this other piece. And I hope you can come to our website and see the videos, because I was hoping to share, but I don't have them at hand. After the pandemic hit, as soon as the pandemic hit, you know, I always say, like, one knows what one knows. And I knew, you know, my partner lost his job. I come from a country where there is no unemployment insurance or support from the government. And the first thought I had was, like, we need to support our early career artists. At the Shed, and I'm going to share later, we have one of our biggest programs is Open Call, which is literally an open call for early career artists from the 5 boroughs. And we work with amazing, amazing artists who many times don't have a full-time job or, you know, healthcare. and whose work was going to be canceled or, you know, moved to another year. And we were like, how do we help them? And as an organization, we are not a granting organization. We are a commissioning organization. So I thought, you know what, let's do a digital commissioning series and let's invite artists to do work current about this time that can also allow, you know, it was not only like, okay, let's, you know, support them financially and creatively, but also let's support audiences who are going through this moment. I always say, for me, artists, I'm not an artist. And so artists are like amazing interpreters of our reality in a way with a sensitivity that I never have. And they give me so much, you know, peace or you know, critical thought. And so we invited our artists to create work. This particular piece, which is definitely my favorite and one of the favorite projects I've ever worked with. This artist, Troy Anthony and Jerome Ellis, are two different composers. Troy was part of our open call piece, and Jerome Ellis was actually the composer of Help, a piece written by Claudia Rankin. And they had both been working at our building on these two different projects at the same time. And one day, Troy, who I was working closely with, mentioned, oh, you know what? Jerome came by. I was playing the piano. He sat next to me. We wrote together a song. It was beautiful. We played it that Sunday because I had a gig at Joe's Pub. That had been pre-pandemic. And one of our first ideas was like, hey, why don't we invite them to collaborate? Jerome's grandfather had just passed at 101 years old. 40 grandkids. I don't know how many like grandkids. He was a priest. Jerome had written a beautiful, you know, piece on his sax to say goodbye to his grandfather, but they couldn't get together. And so this invitation came at that exact time in their lives and made so much sense to them that they decided to create a ritual experience for other people to come and mourn their people that they had lost. And it was, you know, I don't know, 300 people on a Zoom call. They were really thoughtful on how to use that Zoom call and how to, you know, have participatory moments for people to share, but without being invasive, being super respectful. And it was incredibly moving. And I think it was really healing for people. You know, I have people very close to my heart that had come out of hospital very recently before and came to this and said, you know, this was literally a transformative experience. And I think that word transformative is exactly a synonym with relevance, you know, like having artistic experiences, participating in artistic experience that are transformative, that really connect with what's going on to you. Having that pulse of what people, you know, need in that moment is really hard, but at the end of the day is what we need to do as, you know, public programmers, engagers, to connect art and audiences in a way where, you know, they're equal and they're in the room together sharing this experience. A couple other of these projects, you know, this one was, as I mentioned, accessibility is really important for us. I'm going to share a little bit more later. I want to go a little fast, but we worked with this collective of artists who self-identify as disabled. We thought, you know, disabled communities have so much knowledge and so much experience in moments like this, and the notions of collective care and networks of care are really entrenched in their history. And so what can they share? What can they, you know, what can we all learn from them? And so we invited this amazing collective, Brother Sick, who are Ezra and Noah Vinas, Yo-Yo Lin and Danilo Machado, who created this piece, Faces and the In-Betweens, that changed with every phase of the moon, and shared their personal stories of how, you know, they were people that could never stay home and had to continue going to hospitals and what that looked like for them. And then currently the piece that is on the latest piece, and we will have a conversation very soon between Madeline and David Hallberg, the main artist. is this piece by Madeline Hollander, who, had been reflecting on how the pandemic had taken the opportunity for so many dancers who were, in their last season to say goodbye to their audiences. And so I really, again, 15 minutes, of video, but I really recommend 52 Last Bows is this piece. David is, or was actually, the principal dancer at the American Ballet Theater, and it was his last season and he couldn't say goodbye. And this was his goodbye. Third concept, social capital. And again, not gonna go too much into it, but this concept by French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu of this idea of like the richness of togetherness. I'm gonna simplify it, more is impossible. And how we get to this, there's a couple of ways I've gone about it. One is through togetherness to create dialogue and discourse, and the power of creating dialogue and discourse. And so this is a project that I collaborated in. It's a project that was by Creative Time in collaboration with the Brooklyn Museum. And it's a project by artist Suzanne Lacey. I think we were called the community organizers. And based on, Suzanne Lacey's social practice of, privileged listen, she invited us to convocate, that's not a word, but you'll forgive me, English as a second language, to invite 500 people, mostly women, to talk about gender issues and feminist issues. And it was such a beautiful opportunity to have women that had never had the opportunity, never had, the space in their lives, some of them, to have these conversations in the past about, being abused or mistreated, or simply having, amazing opportunities to do things together. And then we had, of course, the public come in, and you could stay in one for the whole duration, or go and listen into different conversations. This idea of not having a fourth wall. And it happened in Stoops in a block in Brooklyn. And then this is the moment where we all came together at the center and had, some beverages and food. And then another similar, very different but similar project in spirit was this project called BYO, Bring Your Own. And the idea is you bring yourself into the conversation. And there were 3 different artists that at the time were working around, dialogue and food. Mac and Ricky, who was doing the breakfast den. This is Heather Hart and Gina Valentine, who do the Black Lunch Table. And finally, Elia Alba, who was doing the Supper Club, which in this case was a project that had already happened always in private space, and we were bringing it to public space. And these were all opportunities for different artists, thinkers, to discuss issues around art and race. Black Lunch Table had started this practice many years ago, and they are still, recording and documenting and writing books about it. And how does this become the kind of art history of the present and of the future? So having those dialogues kind of put into writing what the important conversations are. The second piece to this is how do organizations become conveners and give agency to participants. And so in this case, and this is the image that I shared with Sol to advertise the conversation, this was my first project at Highline. And we were gonna celebrate the opening of the 3rd section of the Highline. And we wanted, again, to not celebrate the Highline itself, not celebrate the park, but celebrate the neighbors, celebrate who were there before the Highline was there and who were going to continue being there. And so we did a few town hall meetings where we heard from all the neighbors what the neighborhood is about. We worked with processional arts workshop, a collective that works on processional objects, but works very particularly with participation of people in their workshops and, you know, creating the processional objects. So they had created this drawings, you know, and these designs and this idea based on what they had heard in the town hall meetings. Then they created this workshops where people, you know, would come and would create like kind of these lanterns with colored paper. And then we literally processed. So this was a train of wagons, and each wagon had to do with one piece of the history, from food to architecture and design, and from, you know, queer life. So all of them had paid homage to one part of the history of the neighborhood, and we were all walking together towards a final, you know, luncheon where we all shared food. And again, it was all based on what they were sharing that the neighborhood meant to them. Fourth, the idea of belonging. And to me, this is really, really important because it's what we always want to achieve. And it's really, really hard for people to feel like they belong in a cultural organization and in a space. And I think part of it is, you know, thinking about it as access. And I think always the word access is a little, you know, it's not enough. And so I've kind of reframed this or reworded this radically welcoming, which is a word or a phrase that is being used quite a bit right now. And I don't know if we all know what it means, but I think, you know, to me, at least it has to do with welcoming community, welcoming their voices, welcoming their presence, welcoming their power, especially those that had been defined previously as others, pushed to the margins, cast out and silenced. And so thinking about that, one of the first projects that I did at the Shed was a very new organization. And I'll ask during the Q&A section how many of you have been. But, you know, it had opened in April 2019. It had had programming, but we hadn't had a moment of saying like, hey, everyone, here we are, we're for you. And so we created this project, Meet at the Shed, that was an open house. And it was literally like one day of free admission and programming, but thought for who it was, right? For everyone. So one of the things that I knew was like, we have a beautiful cafe and bar, Cedric's, best drinks in town, very expensive. So can we bring, you know, food trucks for accessible food? And I know it sounds silly and it has nothing to do with art, but it's so important to the experience. Can we open our windows, right? And this was January 2020. So it was a beautiful day just by chance. We lucked out. We had been working, one of our residents from the very beginning was Reggie Gray Rock and the Dream Ring, which is collective that does flexing type dancing. And we had been working with them doing youth programming throughout the 5 boroughs before the Shed had opened. They afterwards had a beautiful commission at the Shed called Maze, in which I also produced, but we invited them and we invited another group of flexing dancers that had been part of Open Call to do, you know, battles and workshops and dance throughout the building. So this is our lobby, for example. So in the middle of the building, you would like whimsically, I hope, find suddenly, you know, dancers that could show you something amazing or show you how to do it. We had DJs. This was our youngest DJ that day. We had DJ Pearl Hunt, DJ Bembona. The idea was like, you know, music needs to be piping all throughout the building. So in corridors and bathrooms, everywhere, there was music throughout the day. We had at the time another amazing exhibition by Agnes Dennis that was so outstanding, but also so complex and so layered and so difficult to understand and so much information. So what we did was invite 7 different artists. This is Behar Bahani, but to do a little, you know, 7-minute conversation about like a piece that had meant something to them and why. And it could be a performance, it could be a conversation, you know. She was at the time working on an unrealized piece, and there was a whole section of unrealized piece by Agnes Dennis. So like she got the opportunity to do that. It was a day that was field. We had more than 6,000 visitors at the shed in one day. This is one of the workshops. And then there was a concert at the end of the day. And it was a moment, you know, again, of togetherness and of people feeling like, yeah, this place is for me too, you know? And then the other concept here is the concept of gateway or bridge, which to me only means it's the opposite of gatekeeping. And as an English as a second language, that's what sounds more reasonable. And for us, that's open call, a program where it's not only an open call, but also it's a selection process that takes more than 50 to 60 colleagues from around the city, from, you know, producers and programmers and artists and curators and other artists I already mentioned to make the selection. And I'm gonna go past really fast because I'm late and I wanna have time to do Q&A, but these are some of the projects from last summer and the summer of 2019, and they were outstanding, and it's one of my favorite programs ever. We have visual, performing, social practice. Finally, civic participation. And I think this is, you know, what we all aim for, but this is where the limitations start arising, because cultural organizations are very willing to open their doors, but sometimes are hard to be transformed. And so, and civic participation is also something that needs to be organic of citizenship, or not citizenship, but from people. So we can though help, and we can though create space and hold space for this to happen. And so a couple of concepts and projects, the idea of reclamation, right? Reclaiming our space. So this was my last project at the Highline before I left. I worked with 4 amazing social practice artists, Alicia Grullon, Betty Yu from Chinatown Arts Brigade, Shannon Finnegan, and Lisania Cruz. And they all worked with different communities around the area of the Spur, the area that we were about to open at the Highline with, you might remember Simone Lee's piece, Brick House. That was an area that we hadn't worked with too much. We had always worked like from 26th Street down, and we wanted to see, again, who's there? Who can we pay homage to? But also know that that was an area that was changing a lot, that was, you know, about to open the Spur, about to open the Shed, and ensuring that when new people, you know, tourists and New Yorkers from other areas were gonna come, that they were received by the stories of the New Yorkers that had been there before. So Alicia, for example, worked with seniors from Hudson Guild, an organization that serves the public housing there. Lisania worked with youth from the center, from the LGBT center. And then they all created these street signs that we posted in partnership with the Department of Transportation on street level, all around that area, sharing these stories that, you know, I hate saying the little stories, but they are the little stories that are actually big and can allow us to see, okay, these are the stories of the people that live here, right? And they all had their own, you know, artistic way of doing it, but it was so powerful. Many of them are still there. And they all use, you know, original text, original images. And the final is this idea of self-determination or co-creation. And I always go here, you know, to Pablo Helguera's Education for Socially Engaged Art, because I think many times socially engaged art has a lot to do with public engagement, as if, you know, an organization was an artist, and how arts is, you know, I always say audience-centered, artist-driven, social justice inspired. And for this, I wanted to share at the Shed, one of the things that I realized very early on was that we weren't thinking about accessibility, and it felt really important for me, for a 21st century organization that we were. So I founded a Disability Arts Integration Council with 6 members from the field who are either experts, arts administrators, or artists, all self-identify as disabled, and they are, our consulting body. And they're not only consulting with us, we don't necessarily like only bring a project and say like, oh, well, how do we make this accessible? We're consulting as an organization. We have 15 members of our staff from all different departments that meet once a quarter with them. We put agendas together. We decide what we're going to discuss together. They were instrumental, for example, in us being able to curate the Brothers Sick project as part of Up Close. They have been able to help us, create this accessibility text and special tours, but also work with Access as Artistry. And so for Open Call this summer, we had this, map. We had American Sign Language interpretation and verbal description in pieces in partnership with the artists and embedding this from very early on. So this has been transformational in how we work in our cultural competency as staff members. They've been, having trainings. This is, I wanted to share this photo because we have 3 interpreters in this piece because it felt important and relevant. So that's a little bit, and then for next time, I have a PS of concepts that are embedded into everything we talked that I didn't mention, but I want you to have in your mind as you discuss these things, which are intersectionality, transparency, authenticity, accountability, interconnectedness and collaboration, and sustainability. But we'll get to that next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Solana. I've learned so much, and I'm also realizing different terms with which to describe the power of the audience, the public, from your presentation. And I would like to invite everyone to use 2 methods to ask questions. Feel free to type in your questions in the chat, or raise your hand to ask Solana directly. If you type in your questions in the chat, I will read it for Solana. Okay. Oh, that's great. There's Nicole who just raised her hand.
Hi, how are you? So I have a quick question. Do you think that in certain ways COVID has increased a sense of togetherness as well as create a larger advocacy or importance of the arts in the public? And I ask this because we've struggled so much as like the human species with our constant need to like communicate and be together constantly. But I feel like I've seen in certain ways that it has created like a larger importance for the arts.
That's a great question, Nicole. I always say that we still don't know what COVID has done because, I feel these things, these trends and these changes we see throughout time. What I can say is I'm glad to see that many organizations have taken advantage of the crisis, have seen the crisis as an opportunity. I think, many haven't, and many, unfortunately, educators were the first ones to lose their jobs in many organizations. And I feel that what we do and what education does are, cousins. They're I think as a society, and this might be out of my, expertise, but as a society, I do feel that, we have been re-admiring or understanding what the power of art is and how art was key as in our well-being and in our healing and in our, existing throughout these times, but that's still not necessarily reflected in how much support the arts are getting. And then in terms of public engagement and education, etc., I think many organizations have understood what their role was. and some unfortunately didn't. But again, that's kind of very early on.
Perhaps as a follow-up question then, were there programs that would not have been possible to organize if it weren't for the pandemic, that you cherished as a very special moment?
Yeah, in that sense, you know, Up Close in general was something that was definitely born only because of the pandemic. I don't think our organization at least would have started thinking about programming digitally yet if it hadn't been for the pandemic. And I imagine that might have been the case for a lot of organizations. I think a lot of organizations in general, you know, in our case, for example, we didn't have an archive. We didn't have, you know, educators. I think a lot of other organizations resorted to other ways of thinking about it. I do think that a lot of programs wouldn't have happened. But I think in a way that's the how, you know, not the what. I think the work around engaging audiences pre-exists and hopefully will continue even when things go back to normal, if they ever do. I think the how has changed a lot because of the pandemic, that's for sure.
Any other questions? I don't see any raised hand.
Am I going to, am I able to ask a question? Yes. Hi. So, and thank you so much, Solana. I am an artist at Stony Brook and I bought my 2 classes here. I ask a question because my classes are going to collaborate a local museum on an environmental social issues, an online project. So as I listen to the slides that I'm very inspiring, that I understand the scope and the categories that the Shed is working on. But I'm wondering, what do you think? What is the artist's role within your curatorship? I can refer to that. How do you think artists and artwork and the curatorship can spur conversations and reflections on your projects?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I was thinking you were talking about the environment, and for example, one of our large projects for next year is an exhibition by artist Tomás Saraceno, an Argentinian artist that lives in Berlin, and he works on, you know, the environment. And again, his work is so amazing, but also so complex. And so, you know, it's been really important for us to partner, you know, the artist and us and the curator of that exhibition to figure out, you know, what is the best way to create public programming, and in this case, contextualization, particularly around that show. And so, you know, we've been putting together a series of conversations, and the artist has been super instrumental in, you know, discussing with us the themes. Like, we propose something, it's been a dialogue, right? He's been proposing people that he's collaborated with in the past. And in that case, it's really important that the artist is already someone that is so community-minded. So, for example, his work, again, it's super abstract and metaphysic, and, you know, like, he talks about the interspecies communications. And one thing that to me was really important was like, well, how can we always, you know, put our feet on the ground? And there's so many community-based organizations in all boroughs that have been working on issues around, you know, air pollution and water pollution. And so even during the pandemic, which was like a pre-program, because we had already been working on this, we got together Tomás and Harriet Washington, who is a theorist and an academician and a, you know, book writer about, you know, the disproportionate impact of air pollution on Black and Brown communities. And we brought in, you know, a representative from South Bronx Unite and from El Puente, that are 2 community-based organizations working on this, to be in dialogue, right? And so Thomas already had that. If he hadn't, and he had that interest and he had been already in contact with them, but if he hadn't, it would have been kind of our responsibility to work with him. And that's why I'm lucky that I work with living artists, right? That's not always the case, but and collaborate and have a dialogue about, okay, what are the important threads? Who do we bring to talk about this? And in our case, for example, now we're also, youth is really important to the conversations around the environment, because they're like a population that is already engaged and committed and knows more than the majority of people, like at least my generation. And so we're doing specific programming for youth by youth. So we're partnering, for example, with the Highline, who has an amazing teen program looking at the environment, for them to create with us and with the artist. And the artist has been super willing to, work with them to create, tours and inquiry-based prompts. And we're creating like a science fair day for other youth from throughout the city. So I think, artists are kind of the main partner. I don't know if that answered the question. I hope it did.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I am understanding that artists bring up the ideas in the conversations, then collaborate with different social groups that brings out the result and hope for a solution for the specific topic, I guess.
Yeah, I think that can be a way. And in general, I think a short answer would be looking at them as partners, right? Mm-hmm. As people who you can work with in developing this kind of ways into their work.
Yes, thank you very much.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. So Michelle Keegan, what were some of the hardest challenges you had to experience in setting up these community events? Was there any backlash from certain communities, for example, in terms of the danger of misrepresentation, and how did you manage to overcome that?
That's kind of such a key question, such a real thing. I think one of the things that we always, discuss and kind of caution is never thinking that, communities are monolithic, and never thinking that, anyone can speak for a whole community. And so I think the way you go about it in terms of not having people like as representatives of, but just as participants is really important. I would say for me, one lesson learned, for example, to be very concrete, was that Bring Your Own BYO series. We were working, the breakfasts, it was open to everyone. Lunches, though, Black Lunch Table has a practice that is exclusively, they have two tables. They have the artist table and the community table. And the artist table, and this has it's kind of central to their mission, right? Like they started as inspired by the segregation of school lunch tables. They created in a residency where they were the only two women of color at the time, the only two Black women. They created kind of they started the project then, right? And it was let's get everyone who identifies as part of the African diaspora to get together and have a conversation. So for lunch, the community table, I think anyone could come, but the artist table for sure. I don't remember about the community table, but the artist table for sure, it was only for people who self-identify as part of the African diaspora. I actually didn't participate and wasn't even near, right? And I was the organizer. And we had a person come and say, I want to participate. And we said, listen, you can't, it's part of the project. And we had to have a big conversation explaining why it wasn't possible, and it was part of the artistic practice, and they had to respect that. And as an organization, we were gonna enforce that. And in a way, we didn't, I'm gonna say it in the wrong way now. I said it in the right way at the time, but it's not that we didn't care, but it was that is precisely why we're having this conversation. because at the time it was a white woman, and we were like, that's part of the entitlement of privilege, and like we cannot have that happen. And then that wasn't the lesson learned, that was just an anecdote. And then the lesson learned was that for the dinner, Elialba had these dinners mostly in the private realm at the 8th floor, the gallery of the Rubin Foundation. And it was the first time having it in the public space. And the way she did it was that she cooked for all the participants. And so she brought the food and she served all the participants, and it was very intimate. And what we had was some microphones and some speakers for the public to be able to kind of listen in. And I had been very inspired by Suzanne Lacy's project. And I thought, you know, like I'm a person that loves kind of listening in as a fly into other people's conversation. And those were all, you know, amazing artists and thinkers. But we didn't think about how it would feel for the public to be sitting there on the grass, listening and having all these amazing people like eating at a table, eating amazing food. And someone came to me and said, listen, this is not this, I don't feel included. I feel othered. I feel I'm less than. And I don't think that's what you wanted to do, but that's exactly how I'm feeling. And that was, you know, a soul crushing moment of like, oh no, like that's exactly the opposite of what we wanted to do. And so for the following conversation, she had 2 conversations. We brought food for everyone. We brought tables for everyone and chairs for everyone. And again, they weren't part of the conversation because that was the artist's project. And we wanted also to be respectful of the artist's project. But as an organization, our responsibility was for everyone to feel included in a certain way. And then what we created also was a moment at the end of the conversation where, you know, everyone would come out of their kind of role at the main table, if you will, and come in conversation with the public that was still there. And it worked really well. And it was a great, you know, lesson learned.
Thank you. We have a few more questions about, a few more questions that actually expand a little bit more detail of the organization part. So the logistics. And you just shared with us a story that affected your strategy as well. Thank you. So a question from Sebastian. So what actually happens from start to end? I think that's what Sebastian is trying to ask. When you want to make an event, where do you start and how long does it happen? What kind of steps are there? So can you maybe give an example of an event on the High Line?
Yeah, and Sebastian, that's a great question. They all vary so much though, like, you know, because we've talked about like projects that were like 6 months long and had all these little pieces, and then like a conversation online that can happen within a few weeks or a month or something. So I would say though, ideally, and this is hard to have because we don't always have all the information, we have kind of a problem we want to solve in a way, right? And again, I come from public policy, so like that's what informs my way of going about it. I'm sure other people would answer this very differently, but I always try to figure out, okay, what are we trying to connect with a new community? Are we trying to, you know, contextualize a specific artist project? Are we trying to, as a new organization, have a broader strategy of how to, you know, present ourselves in the world? So there's always something that we want to think about and we want to create a strategy for. And we want to think of a format. Formats are really important. We want to think of a format. We want to think about like, who are the voices that we want to have present? And sometimes we start with like an artist that we know that we want to have, or, you know, like the BYO series started because I knew Mackenricky socially. She is the wife of Sean Leonardo and she had come to his performance and we started talking and she said, I have this project. And I said, oh, I love that project. And I know Elialba, you know, like, and so I started with the artist, or you start with the format, or you start with the need. You start somewhere and then you start, or I start thinking about, you know, like how to make this intersectional enough, have multiple entry points, multidisciplinary, how to think about like enriching, right? And then I think it's more about like, okay, let's set up a date. Let's see if everyone can do it. What are the needs, production needs? How, you know, this is a very collective work. So we have usually like a production team, and we do a lot though. We wear a lot of hats, I have to say, but we work with a lot of other colleagues, our marketing team. There's always, you know, like, how do we talk about this that we're gonna do? How do we introduce people? If it's a conversation, who can moderate this, right? Who's someone that can do research about these people and have special questions thought out? And then you work with all of the participants in what they'll need and how they want to do it. I don't know if
so it's a lot of researching and assessing what is required in order to realize a project.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of creative thinking. That's the fun part. And then a lot of working with amazing people, usually artists and thinkers. And so
I feel so jealous. Yes. So Erica asked a question about the pandemic reality more specifically. So I'll just read her question. When you were discussing how to increase social capital, which I think you termed as richness and togetherness, you showed how large food events like the Black Lunch Table can help bring people together. During the pandemic, was there any equivalent event that could replace these large events in order to create a communion with the public? How was the turnout to events in general, in person and online, affected by the pandemic?
Can I actually, Sol, can I ask you to answer this? Because you came, as you said, you came to Troy and Jerome's.
Yes.
And so I wonder, we haven't talked about this. So I would love to know, as an audience member, how did that feel? Did that feel not as a replacement, but as a different way of being in community, and why?
I still remember this as a very early pandemic stage experience for me personally of using Zoom differently. So do you remember which month it was?
May.
May, okay, yeah. So in March, Stony Brook faculty members and students all had to start using Zoom. I didn't even know that this program existed, right? The first week of March. And then third week of March, I had to be using it 10+ hours a week. But the event at the shed, so, you know, I was learning the little tricks available on Zoom. I didn't even know that I could change my name. But one of the exercises that Troy and his partner asked us to do was to change my name to the name of someone that I wanted to remember and pay homage to. And I think many people might have changed their names to someone that they lost. And I did it myself as well. I changed my name to someone that I recently lost, not because of the pandemic, but it was very powerful. I guess it's because I hadn't done it before. Like I didn't know that the function existed. And I still remember that it's a very small thing that I was asked to do as a participant, as an audience member, but I usually don't get to do that in real life. You know, I don't change my name in real life. But in that group, that felt very special. Yeah, so it wasn't a cheesy exercise. I thought it was a powerful exercise. Yeah.
Yeah, to me, in a way that was, you know, and you collaborate with artists, right? So you propose to artists, you know, we want to use technology in a different way, and we want to be intentional about how, you know, we're engaging people digitally because it's what we have, and some, you know, make the best of it. In general, with Up Close as a series, one thing we wanted was that the viewing experience was shared. that the viewing experience meant that people could comment to each other, that there was something about being in a room together, even if we were all apart. And again, I don't think we achieved that in every single project. I think Troy and Jerome's is, again, very special to me because I feel that we all achieved being in that room together in spite of the distance. But I do think, there are creative ways and there are technological ways in which we can, with the right, artistic leadership and creative engagement thought process, achieve that.
Right. Yeah, you're definitely right. The platforms are very important. And I think I felt the event more powerfully because the platform itself was quite new to me. There was novelty aspect of Zoom at the time, probably no longer now, but yeah. So we have 2 more questions and maybe those are going to be the last questions for you, Solana. Thank you very much. So Chiori asked a question, what do you think is the first step for galleries on campus, on university campus like Stony Brook, to become a platform for diverse issues? Perhaps as an extended question, how do you see the overlapping aspects or maybe the differences between education and public program in your work, I guess, in an organization like Highline or the Shed?
So I will say I don't necessarily do education myself as a kind of area of work. I have supervised other people doing that, and I've of course been engaged. I think just to go back for a second to the gallery question, I think there are amazing examples. I always say this Harlem Hunter gallery that Arden directs is an amazing example of how many diverse issues, campus is kind of a microcosm of society, right? The diversity that is in campus is the same. I imagine at a university like Stony Brook is a microcosm of the diversity we have in New York, right? And so just opening up to different voices, to different curators, to different, programmers to do things, for artists to bring projects, this idea of the opposite of gatekeeping, to me is really true. The more we can open, and I think the fake dichotomy we have in our heads that is goes against quality. No, it doesn't. It just brings different ideas and different projects, and then you can ensure that there's always quality. And so I think in general, there's so much possibility. I think education and public engagement are two, as I said before, they're cousins. They're 2 ways of engaging. I'm very interested in education that is in the same way, assuming that students bring assets and bring knowledge and engages them horizontally. When I teach, I don't teach, I learn more, literally. And I know it sounds cheesy, but I learn so much from students because there are so many different perspectives and there are different paths. So I think thinking of education in that way, and of a shared path of discovery and a shared path of it's so important. So I don't know if that answered, but I think that's how I think about that.
Yeah. So some of the audience members at this talk are supposed to imagine and envision and plan public programs for printing Solidarity show at the Zucchero. So their questions might be very direct for that reason.
And I think, you have such an amazing opportunity. To me, the first question is, who are you trying to engage with the show? Is this a show for other students? Is this a show for illustrators or graphic designers that do posters here? There's that amazing poster organization in Brooklyn. You know what I'm talking about, of protest posters that has kind of an historical archive
Yeah, we're bringing their materials, interference archive.
Interference archives.
Yes.
Thank you. I couldn't, oh, amazing. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, I'm really bad with names. I'm sorry. I need Google for everything. But, you know, there are so many movements, you know, in Latin America, all the movement around like gender equity right now and female power and female, you know, abortion and is so important. And they've all been working through posters and through imagery still today. Like, I think part of the thing is that we see it as a historical thing, but still today it's so alive. So, you know, connect, to me, the resonance and the relevance has to do with, okay, what's the relevance today? Why does it matter today if we have historical materials? And I don't know if this, I have no idea about the show you're creating, I'm sorry, but like, you know, those types of questions, why does it matter? And to who does it matter? And how do we help them get there without telling them this is why it matters to you, because we don't know. It's opening the doors through different entry points to say, like, come and tell us, you tell us why it matters to you, but these are some of our guesses, you know, and then potentially inviting people who you want to connect with to do it with you, you know, or ask them, you know, and have that guide the process.
Yeah, thank you. Hannah asked a question. Perhaps, Hannah, would you mind unmuting yourself to ask the question directly, or you would want me to read this question?
I can unmute myself.
Okay, that's great.
So I just wanted to ask, like, in terms of creating belonging, because you talked a lot about it earlier in your presentation. So in terms of creating more of a sense of belonging within our communities, do you think it's more beneficial for artists to bring their work to these communities and like try to create like that sharing kind of feeling and invoke it in those communities? Or do you think it's more beneficial for their work to be showcased in like big museums and galleries?
I personally think it's not an either or, it's an and. I think, you know, big museums and galleries have an amazing platform that maybe when like, and a large kind of amplifying platform, but at the end of the day, the heart of the community is in the community. So can you do both? You know, like when we did those signs at street level, that was kind of a nod to that, which was bring it to communities. I didn't share, but like we've done so much programming in Leandra's garden, in the Fulton houses, near the High Line, at Hudson Guild. So I've always been doing, I always say it's on-site, off-site, and online, right? To me, those are the three spaces. And it's really important to do both for people to come in and feel, you know, seen and represented in the big museum, but also for people to be able to go to their communities and see art there. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think something that I recall is also when you use the term belonging, you actually used it in terms of the audience members and public members feeling belonging in the cultural organization. So how does the cultural organization foster this sense of like ownership for the audience members, so that it's the gate is open, you know, they know that the gate is open, right?
Absolutely. And also meeting people where they are is also key. So for example, the Shed had never done that, you know, open house, but it had youth programs in public schools and in community centers and in cornerstone centers that are like in NYCHA houses all throughout the 5 boroughs for 3 years before it even opened its doors, right? So without having done that and having gone to different communities and say like, there's art here and we're gonna, you know, teach you how to dance, but like we're gonna do this dance program together. And it had, you know, moments of getting all of the programs from all the boroughs together in, you know, in Brooklyn to showcase everyone at the end of the year. So all that work was key to then when we opened our doors and said free admission for everyone and programming specific, for people to be like, oh, these are the people who came to my community center and they, you know, they saw me here too, and I'm invited there. So I feel, you know, it all adds to that sense of belonging. It's not only like, oh, we are the center and you have to come to us. It's that what I don't like, though, if I may say, is organizations that go, you know, with the bus to the community and come and, you know, there's a show, we do a show, we leave, right? Like we come, we show you and we leave. That's not right to me. To me, it's like we come and we do together. And then you're also invited, right?
Yeah, that's yeah, that
So
makes sense. Thank you.
can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead, Stephanie.
So I love this conversation about audience and belonging and how we get there. Yet when you look at the images, right, you still see this line, the idea of audience and the performance for audience. Like, and it's something that even when you're working really hard to get beyond this idea of those who patronize a space in general, and those who, even when so diverse artists are brought in to make work, we're making work under the guise of these people are still looking at us, as opposed to real engagement on both parts with super diverse audiences, right? And so even when you do the work, people who are outside still often feel, though we've been invited in, it's hard to make the step in, right? Because it still feels like this monolith that isn't exactly welcoming, although you're doing all the work to welcome, right? Like there are these social structures at play that make this a really difficult path. And so my question for you becomes, how do we talk about what matters for us, right? And when we're talking, it's like belonging, but belonging to what? What matters for our communities? Because I feel like we talk about communities, and I do the same thing. Like I'm talking about Black community a lot, but at the same time, I understand the Doppler effect of that and how it goes out into like, we are the community. But that understanding still gets lost because we try to pull in very particular strains one at a time often. And I'm trying to figure out how we honor the individual communities, but add to the whole.
Yeah, I think that's the big question that I feel the first thing is, I don't think there's an answer, right? Yeah. I think it's an ongoing process, and it's like, you know, I always say organizations are also a group of people. They're also not monolithic, right? So what we haven't talked at all about today is everything that goes in organizations to, you know, to make any of this happen, in the sense of, you know, like the internal fights about what's important, what's valued, what gets allotted budget and resources. So there's that. Yeah. But just to contextualize, right? I think, you know, it is in a way one at a time. And I think it is in a way the question of sustainability and how, you know, we start somewhere and then we build on that without forgetting about the people we have already established connections with, which is really hard also in organizations, because many times it's like, it's a project, it's a moment, and there is no thinking about that sustainability and that, you know, iterativity in a way. And I think, as we said before, right, like community, I kind of have it's a shorthand using the word communities, but it's not the right word, and it's so overused that it doesn't mean anything anymore. And, you know, communities are never monolithic. And I think, you know, that's why I talk about the limitations of cultural organizations. And I think it goes to mainstream, predominantly white cultural organizations as the ones that I've been talking about. And it also many times goes to, you know, culturally specific community-based organizations, right? All to say, I think that's kind of the big question and the big work that no one has solved in a way, and that we're all working towards, or some of us at least. you know, like to me, the best example is our Disability Arts Integration Council, right? We decided this was a priority. We cannot have everyone represented. We started working with these 6 experts, and we've been building little by little, and little by little, you know, when we start prioritizing, you know, American Sign Language and verbal descriptions, we start doing outreaching within those communities and try to start inviting them. And we know we still have to work with the neurodiverse community. Like there's so, and within each of those, there's so many, and then there's, you know, and so thinking intersectionally, you know, like when we did American Sign Language interpretation this past summer, to us, it was really important that deaf interpreters were centered and that they were deaf interpreters of color. And we worked, you know, like, and so we're always, you know, adding those layers into thinking, you know, who and how we're connecting, who and how we're building space to, for, or with, hopefully with, at the beginning, it's always for.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's going to be about us building together, but it takes time. And I would say, at least at the Shed, which is an organization, you know, just open, we've been open for less than 2 years altogether, because it's very early stages. So right now it's more of a strategy and you know, and it's principles, and it's the way we look at this work, and we're trying to enact this work, but we're very, very far.
If you could see me, you would see me shaking my head with you. And I appreciate that you're doing that work, right? And I agree, it's super hard. And structurally, it's ridiculously hard. And how we get the powers that be or the funders to understand what it is they say they're funding and what the actuality of needs to happen within that, right, are 2 different animals. And I think you have a really interesting position, because the Shed is located, right, like in this crazy, like beautiful space, amazing, in this very rich environment, reaching out, right, but fraught. And yeah, thank you for doing the work, and hopefully we can like pull even more and break some of the structures a little bit.
No, and thank you for bringing that, you know, reality check into the conversation, because sometimes, you know, in simplifying for conversations like this, we don't get into that. I will also add, I think it's many times it's less about, yes, it is about funders, but it's less about funders, and it's more about organization leadership.
Yeah,
I think funders are more interested in doing this work than leadership, and they see many times more the value on this, of this, and we see that more and more, luckily enough. And I think it still needs to catch up with leadership that understand this as kind of the other thing that we do, or the, you know, less important thing that we do.
mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a good place to end this conversation, that there are multiple stakeholders at this juncture of making historical changes today in cultural landscape in this country and around the world. So thank you so much, Solana, and thanks for the audience members who are still here. I hope to invite you, Solana, again to the campus when the world is fully open.
Please.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you all so much. Again, I learned so much from all your questions. So thank you. And best of luck with the exhibition. And
thank you.
I'll come to see that for sure.
Yes.
Participate in the public programs.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Solana. It was really amazing. Many questions remain for the conversation. So like Sol says, maybe we can continue the conversation in the future.
Thank you.